So thank you.
Please
Thanks
start.
so much. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you all here. And isn't it wonderful that through science across the entire globe on Darwin Day, we can all share things that are positive and valuable and bringing benefit to our species. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. I'm especially honored to be directly following Steve Pinker. Some of the things I'll be saying will be drawing quite directly on his work, which I think inspires some important insights into the origins of mental disorders. So I'm a psychiatrist. I've spent most of my career at the University of Michigan, as you may have just learned, helping to run one of the world's first anxiety disorders clinics. Then I moved to Arizona State University to start a Center for Evolutionary Medicine. And I'm trying to advance slide. Okay, let's see if I can use my, there we go. So evolutionary psychiatry is a subunit of evolutionary medicine. Evolutionary medicine and evolutionary psychiatry are not treatment methods. They're simply using the basic science of evolutionary biology to better understand, prevent, and treat diseases and mental disorders in particular. My main point is extremely simple. It is that an evolutionary foundation has been missing from psychiatry, and that's why the field has been confused. Bringing it in should greatly advance our understanding of mental disorders. The story starts for me in the 1970s when I was a junior faculty member, and all around me, people were arguing about what the best way of understanding mental disorders was it psychoanalysis or behaviorism or genetics or brain metabolism? What method was best? Or maybe it was family trauma that caused mental disorders. And it seemed to me that all of those had something to offer, but there should be some way of pulling them all together. Why can't we use all of our knowledge instead of getting stuck in just one? And this goes back again to some things that Steve Pinker has talked about our limitations of human cognition to simplify things so that the mind can grapple with them. In 1982, I found my way to the Museum of Natural History at the University of Michigan, where I was welcomed by some wonderful behavioral biologists, especially Dick Alexander, very famous evolutionary biologist in the States. And they first told me, so welcoming to a doctor. We assume that all psychiatrists study animal behavior and evolution in great depth. And I had to say, no, actually, most of my colleagues have never even heard of the field of evolutionary behavior, of animal behavior, and they know nothing about evolution. And then I discovered that I didn't know much about evolution, despite my deep and long-standing interest. They reported to me that there are two different kinds of explanation needed for anything in biology. One, the proximate explanation of how things work, but a whole different explanation is also needed to understand why things are the way they are. And this distinction, Ernst Mayr was especially helpful, a Harvard biologist, in making it, completely transformed the study of animal behavior by asking not just how the brain works to generate behavior, but also why is the brain the way it is? Again, completely transformed the study of animal behavior. And more specifically, the question that these scientists asked is, how does this behavior influence fitness? By fitness, I mean not their robustness, but how many offspring is this individual going to have? And how does this behavior influence how many offspring the individual has? So this is often called behavioral ecology, pretty much the same thing as the study of animal behavior, but in a more advanced way. But here's the point, that the behavior itself does not evolve, but brains do evolve. And if you look at those 6 brains, I think there are actually 7 of them on the screen, they all look identical, but they're not. The individuals with those brains have very slightly different genes, and therefore those brains give rise to slightly different behaviors. And those individuals whose behaviors lead to having the most offspring are going to pass on more genes than others. So our brains will steadily become maximizers of gene transmission and numbers of offspring. So this led me immediately, and in my work with George Williams, to begin asking this question: Why did evolution leave us vulnerable? It seemed really obvious that disorders must somehow be useful. And it looks like the animation did not work on this slide. Basically, people have proposed that ADHD might be useful. Maybe eating disorders and anorexia is useful. Maybe even schizophrenia is useful. And those are all nonsensical mistakes. That's why I have the big red no sign in front of them all. It's the most serious and common mistake in evolutionary psychiatry. This is viewing diseases as adaptations. Diseases are not adaptations. They are not shaped by natural selection. They do not have evolutionary explanations. So, how can evolution help us if diseases aren't adaptations? It turns out that there is something else that evolution can explain, and that is traits that we all share that make us vulnerable to diseases. Examples in medicine are obvious. What about the appendix? What about the back when so many of us have the back pain? And there's supposed to be an image behind that lovely zipper pointing out the um, problem with the narrow birth canal. What a bad design. Wouldn't it be better if babies could come out through a zipper in the front, sparing many, many deaths and suffering? So this is a fundamentally new question. The old question, the standard for medicine is, why did this individual get sick? What's the mechanism? How does it work? The new evolutionary question is, why did natural selection leave all members of the species vulnerable to this disease? This is a gigantic shift in perspective. We're going from a mechanic's perspective about what's wrong with this car, how does it work, and how can we fix it, to an engineer's explanation for the design of the car. Now, of course, bodies are not designed, they're products of natural selection, but nonetheless, they have designs, that is, aspects that work very well or don't. And understanding those in engineering terms is crucial. So I first wrote about this in 1984, and it quickly became clear that just understanding mental disorders from an evolutionary point of view was starting too far along. Instead, we needed to understand diseases in general. And it was my great good fortune to connect with George Williams because of my previous research on the evolution of aging. And we wrote a paper that he insisted we give a grand title, The Dawn of Darwinian Medicine, and he was right. That title was justified after we wrote our book in 1994. That spurred lots of new interest in people taking an evolutionary view of disease. In that book, we talked about 6 possible specific explanations for vulnerability. The first is the limitations of natural selection. It can't prevent all mutations, genetic drift happens, and natural selection can't start fresh. There's mismatch with changing environments. It's a slow process, and it's far too slow to keep up with pathogens in the arms race that's continuing with all creatures. The top 3 there are limitations of what natural selection can do, but more profoundly, there are things that natural selection does and succeeds at that also leave us vulnerable. That is, trade offs with benefits that leave us vulnerable to disease, and especially selection for traits that maximize reproduction at the expense of our health. And finally, defenses like pain, cough, inflammation, and anxiety and low mood that seem like they're diseases, but they are not diseases. They're useful responses shaped by natural selection that are useful in certain circumstances. So this has led to rapid growth of the field of evolutionary medicine. I think it's now 33 years old, and we have a wonderful Oxford Press journal. If you're interested in all of this, please go to evmed.org, where you can find out more. That's the home site of the International Society for Evolution, Medicine, and Public Health. And if you're really interested, join us for our 10th annual meeting in Tennessee. Some of it may be on Zoom, but I'm afraid most of it will be in person. It's been so thrilling actually to see that these insights and all of this research have led to practical benefits that we couldn't imagine when we started in this area. A genetic tracking of the origins of an epidemic, whether it's COVID or something more mundane. Antibiotic resistance strategies based on evolution, because antibiotic resistance is a product of evolution. I think most practically of all is what's called adaptive chemotherapy, where instead of using the maximum possible dose to blindly try to eliminate all cancer cells, taking an evolutionary and ecological view allows the use of lower doses of chemotherapy and giving better results. Very fascinating work. And finally, when is it safe to use drugs to block pain, fever, nausea, vomiting, anxiety, and depression? And when should we let those natural responses happen? So back again when I was starting my career, there's a huge push to eliminate psychoanalysis and replace it with what was called a medical model. Psychiatry was a frustrated field and it thought that medicine has succeeded by looking for mechanisms, and finding out about those mechanisms has led to many new treatments. So let's try to do the same things as medicine has done. So we now have 50 years of work by thousands of smart scientists and billions of dollars of research. We are able to define specific disorders by listing symptoms in a way that's much more reliable than before. And we've been looking for specific genes and brain's causes for specific disorders. This is what we expected to find: nice distinct disorders with specific biomarkers caused by specific abnormalities that suggested specific treatments. It was such a hopeful time. And soon we had the decade of the brain and vast scientific support for work in this area. But this is what we actually found. Everything seemed so messy. All the diagnoses turned out to overlap. And we still have found no specific brain abnormalities for any major mental disorder, with the exception of Alzheimer's disease. No specific genes with large effects, and no new specific treatments coming from this huge scientific enterprise. These are wonderful scientists doing good work, and it's all valuable new knowledge, but it hasn't worked to provide what we so desperately need to deal with mental disorders. Here's where evolutionary psychiatry comes in. I'll remind you again, this is not a method of treatment, and it certainly is no panacea. It's no easy solution to all of these problems, but it does provide a missing scientific foundation for this field. It's still just getting started, but here are some of the books that are in the field. And there are a number of organizations, including the Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group from the Royal College of Psychiatry, and another book by the Royal College of Psychiatry, the one on the right. And my book is the middle one, Good Reasons for Bad Feelings, an accessible, easy reading version. And now I'm going to give you very quick examples for 6 different disorders. Each one of these deserves an hour or more to make a proper scientific case. My goal here is only to share with you the excitement in the field and the opportunities, maybe for people like you to help to understand why natural selection left us vulnerable to all of these disorders. As I mentioned, I spent 40 years helping to develop one of the world's first anxiety disorders clinics. And early on, it was easy to recognize that anxiety is a useful response. In a threatening situation, the responses of anxiety help you get out of that situation and avoid it in the future. It readjusts your physiology and your behavior and your facial expressions in ways that allow you to better cope with threats. Furthermore, natural selection shapes pretty fancy control mechanisms to be on the lookout for those threats and to set off the right amount of anxiety of the right kind in the right situation and then turn it off. But those mechanisms don't seem to work very well. Almost all of us have way too much anxiety in many, many situations. Why is that? I racked my brain on that for a decade. I tried to, is natural selection just not that good? Is that why we have so much useless anxiety? And then I finally took the mathematical theory of signal detection theory, actually by Swetson Green, 1966, started at the University of Michigan, and applied it to my patients who are having panic attacks. And this resulted in the smoke detector principle. The principle here is that cheap false alarms are necessary to prevent possible huge losses. Here's an image. Can you see that? There's something in the grass. And depending on your computer's resolution, it might be obvious that it's a tiger, or it might not. But should you flee? Let's do the math. The optimal threshold for a response, that is, How confident you have to be that there's a lion there depends on the cost of the response, the cost of running away. The benefit of the response if the danger is present will assume you get complete protection. The cost of the response if the danger really is present and you don't express the and you don't run away, and the probability that the danger is actually present. We'll put numbers on these because if the predator might be present, it's optimal to express the panic attack and run away as fast as you can whenever the probability that the lion is actually there, I think it was actually a tiger, is greater than the cost of panic versus the cost of no panic. Putting numbers on it, cost of a false alarm, 100 calories. Cost of no panic, if it's a lion, death. That's 100,000 calories. The ratio is 1,000 to 1. And this, to my amazing surprise when I first calculated it, means that 999 panic attacks out of 1,000 will be unnecessary, but perfectly normal for an optimal system. This turned out actually to be useful in many ways, and not just for psychiatry. The most common decision that physicians make every day in the clinic is whether to use drugs to relieve pain, cough, fever, nausea, and the like. Most of them are not using the smoke detector principle in their thinking. They're using simpler algorithms, but this is the right way to do it, and it has major implications for psychopharmacology. Some people argue that using drugs to influence your mood is bad, and other people say, oh, no, we should all be using them. This gives a scientific foundation for making those everyday clinical decisions that we really need to get out there to physicians and others. This has amazing benefits in the clinic, actually. Once I recognized this principle, I could talk to patients about it. Here's a case of a patient who insisted on a referral to cardiology, saying, I know it's not in my mind. I can feel my heart pounding, and I think I'm having a heart attack. And I said to him, you know, your heart really is pounding, and that's because you're having an emergency response. It's a useful response. I didn't have to use the evolution word. It's a useful response that your body sets off when you're in life threatening danger. So if you even think you're in life threatening danger, it's going to go off. And now, because you notice your heart pounding and you interpret it as a heart attack, that becomes its own life threatening danger and sets off a positive feedback cycle. And the patient paused and said, thanks. I wish somebody had just explained that. Now I just won't worry about it. This doesn't work for all patients, but it's foundational for good treatment of panic disorder instead of saying vague things about it's your brain. Depression is much harder. It's obvious how anxiety is useful. Depression doesn't seem very useful at all. The usual approach is what's wrong with this person? The evolutionary approach asks a different question. Why are we all vulnerable to depression? More specifically, why do we have a capacity for low mood? In what situations is low mood useful? And why is it often so dysregulated? Why do we have so much useless depression? So, what about this question about why the capacity for mood exists at all? It doesn't have to, but it does, and it's because situations differ. There are good situations where a little effort will get you a big payoff. In that situation, a lot of effort and taking risk will be worth it. On the other hand, there are lots of other situations when no matter what you do, you're just going to be taking useless risks and wasting energy. And those situations, low mood avoids wasted efforts and excess risk. There's something called optimal foraging theory from basic behavioral ecology that tells how long an individual should persist in a particular patch. In this case, each raspberry bush is a different patch, and this raspberry picker is trying to decide, should I keep picking from this bush or should I go looking for another one? What's the optimal time to stay? Eric Charnov did the work to demonstrate that in a marvelous triumph of behavioral ecology. I won't bore you with the calculus, but here is a graphical presentation of his discovery. Here's how long it takes to find a new bush. This is called the search time. So the person starts here and goes looking for a new bush and finds a bush on an average at that time. At first, it's very easy to get a lot of berries from the bush. So this is steep, and then fewer and fewer. And at this point, the person has gotten every single berry. You get this many berries in this amount of time. So this slope is the rate of getting berries. And this person left too soon and gets fewer berries than this person with the black line. This person stayed right to the end, gets this many berries in this amount of time. That's fewer berries per minute. This person stayed the optimal length of time and gets the maximum number of berries per minute. This is profound because that influences um, the structure of our days. We do different things for a little while or longer, depending on how much it's paying off, and then we move to another one. Early on, there's a thrill of a new opportunity, and then low mood helps us disengage and move on. Now, of course, in life, we're not just looking for berries, we're looking for approbation and praise from other people. We're looking for people to care about us and love us. We're looking for political affiliations. So we start off like this, but tendency is to persist a lot. And when useless efforts persist, this ordinary low mood that helps us to disengage from things we're trying to do turns into depression. This is not actually a new idea. William Blake in 1788, in one of the illustrations from his book, says, if any could desire what he is incapable of possessing, despair must be his eternal lot. And every religion long before Blake has noticed the relationship between desire and frustration and anger and despair. But for me, this means that we should be looking for people who are pursuing unreachable goals because pursuing unreachable goals is a recipe for depression. I've taught my residents, ask your patients, is there something you are trying to do that you can't give up, even though it seems that you'll never succeed? And my residents, that is, my trainees in psychiatry, have told me this is the most valuable thing because very often it'll reveal things that weren't revealed even by a detailed interview. So there's another way to do this. In medicine, we do a review of systems, go into each different area of the body and ask and see if there are any problems there. In psychiatry, we need to be doing a comparable review of social systems. And these are the six main categories from behavioral ecology or resources that all organisms pursue. Social resources, friends and status, occupation, and a valued role within the group. Children, family, kin, others who share our genes, income and physical resources, abilities, appearance and health, and other personal resources, and love and sex. Turns out it's not so easy to allocate your effort amongst those things, however, because every time you put more effort into one, there's less effort available for the other. Takes about an hour to go through with an individual what they have and want and hope for and fear in each area, asking what they're trying to do in each area and their expectations and what emotions are. It gives you a deep, genuinely biological explanation for individuals. This whole idea that evolutionary psychiatry just makes generalizations is a big error. I think an evolutionary approach to psychiatry encourages spending a lot of time with each individual, trying to understand what's going on for them in their life. Here's one case where we couldn't find the cause of the depression after a 1 hour interview by the resident. And we went through the six categories and we said, well, how are things going with your daughter? And all of a sudden the woman got teary and said, actually, I've devoted my life to trying to keep my daughter out of drugs. But then right after high school, she moved in with a drug dealer and now she won't answer my phone calls, even though I call her 10 times a day. Isn't that heartrending? But it's a common problem for parents of kids who are on drugs or living with drug dealers. We changed the scheme for her to say, are your calls to her helping her? No. And she changed her approach to instead helping other children who were addicted to drugs, and her depression vanished and she found new purpose in life. And then there are many students we see at the university who are trapped pursuing a PhD that's not going to lead to any job. And they're just getting in deeper and deeper and deeper, or they're recognizing that their thesis won't actually succeed. A perfect recipe for depression. I emphasize here that I'm not saying that all depression is caused by pursuing an unreachable goal. Some of us do just plain bad genes or bad drugs that a person has in their system or bad physiology. But this is a key to actually a deeper understanding. Addiction's been a deep interest of mine. Why on earth are we so vulnerable to alcohol addiction and drug addiction? Well, it's because we have learning mechanisms that are chemically mediated, and drugs that get directly into the brain can take over those learning mechanisms and get us to do things again and again, even though we don't want to. I had the privilege of working with Kent Berridge on this. He's the person who came up with the idea that we should distinguish liking from wanting in the dopaminergic actions in the brain. But the basic principle here is that pure drugs and routes of administration like needles haven't been around for that long. So there's no ability of natural selection to shape protection against these problems. It's a terrible plague on our species. I think if we do go to other planets and we find a species that also has chemically mediated learning mechanisms, they too will be trying to figure out how to cope with addiction. Eating disorders has led to a lot of very silly theories about how anorexia in particular can be useful. But I take an approach that has a multifaceted approach. That is, that modern media and the very fact of photography makes big time competition for certain kinds of appearance. And that leads some people who are a little bit heavy to decide, I'm going to get thin like those attractive people in the pictures. I'm just going to stop eating for a few days. But if you do that, the famine protection mechanism shaped by natural selection kicks in. And after a day or two, you find yourself staring at a whole gallon of ice cream that you've eaten all at once, even though you don't really want to. And much worse, after repeated episodes like that, your body weight goes up a little bit because in situations where food availability is not reliable, it's good to put on a few extra pounds. This sets up a very nasty, vicious cycle because you decide to stop eating, and that sets off the famine response. That leads to loss of control of eating, making a person terrified that they're going to gain more weight. And so they try harder to restrict their eating. And of course, it doesn't work. This doesn't cure eating disorders. I wish it did. Logic is not a powerful intervention, but this basic understanding of what's going on, I think, is missing from a lot of eating disorders research. And finally, we come to something that Steve has been so instrumental in helping us recognize, and that is the social cultural niche. And it's not that long that we've been speaking to each other. It's not that long since social relationships have been the key to reproductive success. I give you an analogy first, a wrenching transition to standing upright. Just imagine what it was like for Lucy and her compatriots 2 million years ago and when they first stood upright. I mean, it's bad enough now. We have neck pain and back pain and hernias and varicose veins and arthritis and shin splints and plantar fasciitis. And this is after 2 million years of evolution trying to fix these things from a bipedal stance. I think something exactly as severe might be accounting for some of these bad mental disorders we have now, dyslexia, and especially schizophrenia. People have been talking for decades and decades about maybe schizophrenia is a product of evolution to a modern environment. Well, now there's actually ways of getting evidence about this. And it's been just thrilling to see this happen. And it's not gotten through to most of schizophrenia researchers. This is a wonderful article from 2019. It was confirmed by another article in 2023, looking at the age of the alleles that influence the risk of schizophrenia, with the idea that if natural selection created strong selection for new alleles that make us smarter, as Steve was talking about earlier, and make us have language abilities and different cognitive advantages, that those genes coming in might have disrupted all kinds of other systems and made them not work nearly as well at all. So this study looked at the age of the alleles that increase the risk of schizophrenia, and those older alleles tend to be increasing the risk. And then it looked for newer alleles. Turns out that newer alleles protect against the risk, very much confirming the idea that strong selection made us more vulnerable, and then continuing selection has tended to provide protection. A much more rich view of how natural selection works. Last example is Alzheimer's disease, terrible plague on our whole species. And now that populations across the world are aging, we really need to do something about it. Many drug companies have tried. They've spent $4.2 billion, and that was last year, on trying to develop drugs to disrupt beta amyloid because that is presumed to be the problem. It's viewed as a toxic byproduct, so we must get rid of it somehow. Um, Also, there's been a great emphasis on one particular gene. This is one of the few diseases that has one gene with a big effect. ApoE4 increases your risk of Alzheimer's disease substantially. So those are the usual responses of trying to get rid of that amyloid beta and trying to deal with people who unfortunately have a bad gene. An evolutionary approach is very different. It first asks the question of why does amyloid beta exist at all? It's not an accident. As Kumar and others in their research at Harvard have shown, it's a pretty potent antimicrobial. The image on the right shows amyloid beta surrounding bacteria that have been injected into the brain of a mouse. As for ApoE4, that gene really does increase risk of Alzheimer's disease in modern societies. But my colleague Ben Trumbull at the Center for Evolutionary Medicine in Arizona State University has shown that it slows the rate of cognitive decline in the Chimani foraging population. Why? Well, it turns out that ApoE4 increases inflammation, and a lot of the cognitive decline in that population is due to infection, not to Alzheimer's disease. So here we summarize evolutionary psychiatry is ready to help solve some of the problems psychiatry faces. It's the missing half of a fully biological psychiatry, a foundation for what I would call a genuine medical model instead of the medical model that uses only half of biology. And it's a method for understanding individuals as individuals and integrating framework for considering all possible treatments. And it just makes mental disorders make more sense instead of all the controversy that tends to surround them. We are just at the very dawn of evolutionary psychiatry. It's already useful, but it's not a treatment method. It's just a foundation for decades of future development, and we're ready to spend that time and effort. Here are some of the resources for people who are interested. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you today.